Well, welcome back, everyone, to Tip of the Spear with your Missoula County Commissioners. This is a podcast of the Missoula Board of County Commissioners. I'm Dave Stromer. I'm joined by County Commissioner Josh Slotnick. Commissioner Vero is unable to make it today, so we're just going to try to wing it ourselves and not flub it up too much.
Do our best.
But one of our last episodes, we had Max Rebholz on with us to discuss wildfire preparation and preparedness. This is especially acute, recognizing that climate change certainly has a direct effect on the ways in which wildfires burn, the duration in which they burn during the year, but also a reality that we live in a fire-adapted climate and landscape in which fires have burned here for millennia. But one of the things that we did not talk about with Max that's super important, even though as I look outside today, there is relatively clear air, it will likely not always stay that way. And the topic is, for today, wildfire smoke preparedness. And this is a little bit above and beyond preparing your home for wildfire so it survives a fire, but it's how do we prepare for smoke that will inevitably enter our atmosphere and airshed in the Missoula Valley, and as luck would have it also, this week is Wildfire Smoke Preparedness Week, July 9th through the 16th. So in the spirit of addressing this topic, we have a couple of esteemed colleagues and guests on the line today. We have Air Quality Specialist Sarah Coefield and Climate Action Program Manager Caroline Bean to join us today, and they will help us learn a little bit more about steps that all of us can take to help make it through these smoky days, which are probably coming down the pike at some point. Josh.
Yeah, so thanks so much for joining us today, Sarah and Caroline. And I have to say to all the dozens and dozens of listeners that we have, that in Missoula County, we are awash in highly competent, super smart people who take their obligations really seriously. And of those folks, these two are at the tippy top. We are so lucky to have both of you. And you out there, any resident in Missoula County, you are lucky too to have these really crazy effective people working for you. So before we dive in, and kind of by way of introduction, Sarah and Caroline, would you mind telling people a little bit about what you do? What got you to play this role? So why don't we start with you, Sarah?
Awesome. So my name is Sarah Coefield, Air Quality Specialist with the Health Department. And I like to tell people that I let them know if they can breathe the air or not. Is it a good idea to go outside and take a big whiff? In reality, my job is a bit more nuanced than that. As an air quality specialist, I do a lot of the smoke management around outdoor burning and prescribed burning and trying to make sure that we balance the needs of ecosystem burns with the needs of people to breathe clean air. And so a lot of my time in my job is really regulatory, but it really does that big shift toward public health and doing what we can to protect our people as best we can when there's smoke that we can't control. Like, we have yet to learn how to regulate lightning. And that means that I need to be able to at least respond to it somehow and help people get through our longer fire seasons. One of the things I like to point out to folks is in most fire seasons, not many people really lose their homes to a fire. I mean, obviously there are terrible exceptions, but in a given community, way more people are going to be affected by the smoke from the fire than by the flames from the fire. And so it's really important that all of us have good tools and ways to stay protected from that smoke. Now, I came to my job somewhat, I guess, organically. My father was the air quality meteorologist for the Montana Department of Environmental Quality for 30 years. So I grew up basically watching him do a version of this job, but for the state. And I thought it was really boring. I mean, oh my goodness. You can't see the air. He was surrounded by maps and computers, and it just seemed really boring. His office was awash in paper. And now I'm in a cubicle with maps and computers, and I'm awash in paper, and I'm like, this just seems really organic right here. And he's the one who actually encouraged me to apply for this job, because he was like, you could do this. I'm like, well, I want to go back to Montana, and I want to stay in science, because at that point my degrees were all in science plus a journalism degree to balance everything out, and made it here to Missoula and had a crash course in air quality, and I've really kind of taken it on for myself and found a real passion with wildfire smoke preparedness, just because I've seen how very, very sick people can get when they're exposed to the smoke, and also I've seen that there are steps that we can take that are really practical, and the technology exists to do something about it. And so trying to get that message out as best I can so we can survive these really long smoky summers.
Great.
I had no idea this was the family business for
It
you.
is. We always have something to talk about now. It drives my mom crazy.
That's amazing. Well, I'm Caroline Bean. I'm the Climate Action Program Manager. Thank you for having us here with you today. And so in my role, I have the privilege of trying to implement all of the wonderful, bold, ambitious policies that Missoula County has adopted to decrease our impact to climate change and also prepare for the impacts that are coming. So one half of that is some of the preparedness, adaptation work, like Wildfire Smoke Ready Week that I get to do with Sarah and others. And then the other half is what we call climate mitigation, or trying to reduce our impact that's contributing to climate change. So things like our 100% clean electricity goal, working on electric vehicles, trying to make our buildings and offices more efficient. It's a pretty wicked problem, and you can approach it from a million different ways. So there's never a day to be bored in this role. I came at it, it seems a bit circuitously at times, although when I was in third grade, someone let me watch Erin Brockovich, which is rated R, and it was kind of a touchstone for me around environmental justice and power. And for those who aren't familiar, it's a story of a utility contaminating the groundwater and community becoming more aware of the impacts and coming together to fight that pollution. And so I've always sort of thought back to that Julia Roberts film in the late 90s or early 2000s. And then from there, it was an interest, but I kind of weaved in and out. I studied environmental history in college and then urban planning in graduate school, and then have since just been pretty laser focused on local climate action. But as I said, we do a lot here in Missoula County, so I get to be pretty curious about a whole myriad of topics.
Well, you can add being a participant to podcasts
There we
to
go.
your list of accomplishments. So, standing around a campfire, typically folks are, when the breeze is moving this way and that, you can see folks shifting to try to get away from the smoke. Or when I was a wildland firefighter back in the day, I did not purposely seek out the heaviest smoke to breathe. So I think intuitively we realized that smoke's not super great for you and is not great to breathe. But having said that, talk to us a little bit about, are there certain groups that are more susceptible to adverse impacts from smoke, who are more at risk for health problems if they breathe smoke? And what are some of the possible side effects, health implications of that?
Yeah, well, certainly, in case you can tell by my super awesome gravelly voice, this is Sarah again. So there are definitely groups who are more susceptible to wildfire smoke health impacts. One of the really important ones is young children. Kids' lungs don't finish developing until they're basically at adulthood, and so you have this kind of fragile organ that's still undergoing development. When you expose it to the pollutants and the wildfire smoke, that can really adversely affect those kids. You know, we've seen wildfire smoke studies that have come out and shown that when we're looking at an age group, admissions to hospitals for asthma symptoms during a smoke event, the 0 to 1 and 0 to 4-year-olds have a huge spike in the amount of emergency department visits than you would see in a non-smoky period. There's also this really fascinating natural wildfire smoke study that came out of California, where they had some baby monkeys that were outside during the 2007 wildfires in California, and not intentionally, but they were exposed to the entire smoke event, and they followed those monkeys into, you know, their version of adolescence and adulthood, and found that they had stiffened lungs even as they grew up. They had decreased lung capacity, and there were even like some alternations to the immune function that got passed on to their offspring. So we do know that there are really serious health implications from being exposed to that smoke. And then plus we've seen the studies showing the adverse impacts on those really, really young babies and children. And then we also know it's just bad for kids in general. And you can see increased worsening and severity of asthma attacks and decreased lung function and increased susceptibility to infectious disease because it affects your immune system functions. And so we really worry about kids overexposure to smoke. And you have to balance it, of course, the fact that kids have to exercise and be outside. Well, what do you do? It's one of those wicked problems. But we do know that smoke is really harmful for children. And then also for the elderly. Folks who are older, their systems have been through a lot already. And adding smoke exposure onto that is never a great idea. And so that's the other age group that you tend to see a big spike in more health complications coming out of smoke exposure. We've also seen studies looking at pregnant people and the likelihood of lower birth weights and other considerations. That's still kind of an emerging science. They're looking at the impact of smoke exposure on pregnancy, but there do seem to be some impacts. And of course, it's one of those things like the Wormery study. Wildfire smoke, really the worse information becomes. So, now we know that it affects the blood-brain barrier. because you set off this systemic inflammation when you breathe in the smoke, and that starts to impact your blood-brain barrier. They're concerned that it could lead to some early aging type symptoms. So that's still in like animal studies work. They haven't been able to like really look at human studies on that yet, but there's some concerns of neurological issues. And then anyone with heart or lung disease is at increased risk of worsening symptoms, worsening COPD symptoms, so chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is your chronic bronchitis, your emphysema, and any kind of heart condition. So if you have high blood pressure, you're at increased risk for wildfire smoke. And we do see increased heart attacks during and right after a smoke event. You have increased hospitalizations due to pneumonia complications. And then there's even a study that came out from our own university here looking at the residents of Seeley Lake following the Rice Ridge fire, and they found that the folks who were exposed to that smoke, which was the worst smoke we had ever seen, and actually that anyone had ever seen, because I asked my friends in the EPA and Canada, like, hey, have anybody seen smoke like this? And they're like, no. And so the people in Seeley were exposed to just incredible levels of smoke, and the university went and they were testing lung function, and they went back for 1 or 2 more years and continued to see that reduced lung function in that population. So never great news. There's never good news, but obviously human health is a spectrum, and some people will be able to tolerate smoke more than others, but there's folks who we're really most concerned about. And then also the people who can't get away from smoke are at higher risk, people who are outdoor workers or unhoused or are inadequately housed and don't have a way to clean their air at all. And so when you're looking at who all is at high risk from smoke, it's a huge chunk of our population, and it's not a number that I can really help on a one-by-one basis. I would really love to be able to just like give everybody, here's an air cleaner for you, one for you, one for you, and I don't have the resources to do that. So it's, literally tens of thousands of people in our county that are considered higher risk.
And just to be clear, stiffened lungs is not a virtue of rugged individuals.
Correct.
If I'm hearing you correctly.
Yes, correct.
Okay, not something to
It is not great.
aspire to.
It is
Okay.
not great.
Yeah. So I want to ask you guys a question about air filters. But before I ask the air filter question, I had another human health question. And this is about exposure and how much exposure does it take before we get some of these health effects. I'm just wondering, so let's say we have a 3-week smoke season or a 4-week smoke season, and then we're good for another 48 weeks or something. If you live through a pattern like that for multiple years, how does that compare to living through 8 weeks or 10 weeks of smoke at one time? And does a solid dose every year begin to add up year after year? Do we even know these things? I mean, the effects of smoke over time are pretty new.
Yeah, we really don't know, and that's one of the issues of it being kind of a newer thing. We only go back to like 2000 of when we had our first like insane fire season in the area, which my college roommate called it the smiting of Montana, because it was really crazy. I remember calling my dad and being like, should I be working in this? Because at the time I was doing water quality testing for DEQ, and I was like, I can't see anything. It's like, just don't run. And we've become a bit more, nuanced since then. But we have only recently started to see people attempting to do like these longitudinal studies of like what is the impact of smoke over a season or year after year. And the tricky thing with those are the smoke isn't always there. Yeah. And so it's for researchers to line up the funding to get a community, to get people signed on, and then hope the smoke shows up. It makes it a really tricky study to do. There have been some research projects done looking at wildland firefighters, because that's more of a population you can get to, but that's not necessarily like a couple week at a time exposure anymore. Like a lot of times those folks, they're exposed basically year round, because if you really want to be on the wildfire firefighting circuit, you can do firefighting pretty much year round anymore, because somewhere is going to be on fire at any given time. But those wildland firefighters, they are seeing some pretty significant health impacts on that population because of their exposure. But it is certainly a question that is really relevant, and one that people are really interested in and trying to learn more about. And it's one that we just know mostly the acute impacts of, after the fire exposure, you see this amount of increased risk of this endpoint health impact happening, and those journals are really kind of hard to suss out for people, because it's always based on a 10% increased concentration. You see 1% increased risk of this, and that's not easy to translate to people. So it really comes down to folks really paying attention to how their body responding to smoke, how your kids are responding to the smoke, trying to stay in as clean of air as possible, and really respect the boundaries that your body is giving you. Like if you're starting to like have the heaviness on your chest or headaches or some wheeziness, get out of the smoke or reduce your activity levels like way down and stop exposing yourself to it as much as you're able. And there are some complications that folks who have to work outside. There are no labor protections in Montana for people for exposure from wildfire smoke. There aren't those boundaries we'd want to have on people's exposure on a regulatory basis anywhere. And so that's a tricky thing.
You might say we're at the tip of the spear.
Yeah.
Some of this out.
So before we do the filter piece, I wanted to ask you a question. I'm sorry, I'm going off script here, but as someone who's lived here for most all my life, I remember a time when bad air in Missoula was the winter. This was way back when we had wood stoves in every crummy rental in the urban core, and we'd have 24 stage 1 air alert days a year, and they would be in the winter. In the summer, it would never happen. I didn't really ever see smoke in the valley. There was a terrible fire in Yellowstone in the late 80s, and then we didn't have real smoke in the valley until 2000. And now, because of what Jared Diamond calls historical amnesia, we just expect that every year could be a fire year, when really for a really, really long time it wasn't. And yet when people say this is about climate change, other folks say, well, you can't really draw a line there. What would you say to that, Caroline?
Well, I'd say to your first point about the winter pollution and now after the summer, now wildfire smoke is our number one source of air pollution in the valley. So it's completely flip-flopped. Our Climate Ready Missoula plan tried to look at the climate impacts that we'd experience in Missoula County with climate scientists at UM. And we did find that there would likely be longer wildfire seasons, which could bring more wildfire smoke. But at the same time, we are a fire-adapted landscape. We've had smoke here before.
And I guess I would just add that part of those decades in our earlier lives, even though you might look like 57, you're only 25, and that's how badly it's affected.
Day over 56.
There have been literally decades throughout the 20th century in which the lack of smoke in the air at times was a result of our very effective fire suppression. And so I think that's part of our memory that we have of times where it seems like now is very different than it was.
Okay.
Well, it was, but...
So I've heard this tons of times, and I'm glad Dave's written actual books on fire. It's someone who doesn't know about this stuff. That for years we suppressed fires, and that caused all this fuel to build up, and now we have a situation that's way worse. So if I think back even 40 years ago, the technology we had was way crummier than the technology we have right now, right? Well, Rice Ridge Fire, we couldn't put it out. We couldn't put that out in, what year was that, 2017? With fantastic technology, incredible communications capability, state-of-the-art airplanes. How in the heck were we doing fire suppression that was so powerful we never had smoke in 1950, in 1960, in 1940 with less technology, less human resource, and less dollars, and yet we can't put it out now? Something in there feels off to me.
Well, the other thing, and not to take us too far,
you got to answer the question, though, man.
Yeah, so
you can't dodge that.
So part of it is, I think, historic amnesia to some extent, in that prior to European settlement, prior to fire suppression, there were many millions more acres burning across the landscape of North America than there are today.
More acres burning.
So it's
different types of fires?
Well, yes and no. So we've, to some extent, told ourselves this enough times that we've started to believe it, and it is factually false that somehow more acres are burning now as a result of climate change. More acres actually burned, way more acres, prior to Europeans arriving on the scene in conjunction with Native American burning than there are today. However, some of the acres burning today are burning in a way that is uncharacteristic over the long span of time because of our fire suppression efforts and fuel buildup. Back to your question, though, we have traditionally, nothing has changed in terms of the effectiveness of suppressing fires from the standpoint that there has always been 2 to 3% of fires that get really big. About 97% effective, and always have been, in terms of suppressing fires on initial attack when the fire weather conditions are correct. And when fire weather is extreme, fires will get big regardless of what we're doing. In some cases, more directly to your point, it was easier to suppress some of those fires when there is maybe less fuel buildup in the forest than there is today. So yeah, we've got more technology today than we have ever had to suppress fires, but because of the decades-long assault on fire on the landscape that we've made, we've created more problems for ourselves. So it's kind of tracked along. Primitive technology, easier to suppress fires.
We made the fires harder to suppress.
In some circumstances.
And as Caroline is pointing out, longer, hotter summers exacerbate the situation.
There is a kind of a elongation of the fire season now that would allow, in certain circumstances, clearly we've had a very lovely, wet, green spring thus far.
Such a beautiful
All the stuff on the hills is going to dry out soon enough and combust. And
by Tuesday, I believe.
Sarah's phone is going to be ringing off the hook.
So when it's ringing off the hook and people say, filters, what am I supposed to do? There's your filter softball question.
All right. So there are a kind of a variety of different filters out there on the market. The best one is going to be your HEPA filter, which stands for high efficiency particulate air. And these are filters that are really designed to catch those really, really, really tiny particles we're most concerned about. Because when we're talking about impacts of wildfire smoke, we're really talking about the really tiny particles in smoke. And we call it PM 2.5, or particles 2.5 microns in diameter and smaller. And that's just what they're called by the EPA, because that's how you measure it. You measure all the particles 2.5 microns in diameter and smaller, and that's your criteria pollutant is PM 2.5. Well, the particles in wildfire smoke are that and smaller fraction. They are typically far less than 1 micron in diameter. And when you breathe them in, they go like super deep into your lungs and can pass into your bloodstream, and that's when you get the inflammatory response. So you want filters that are actually effective against those really tiny particles. And so the HEPA filter is the one that's going to do the best job at capturing all of those particles. All filters have this kind of efficiency dip between 0.1 and 0.3 microns in diameter, where their ability to capture those particles goes down. Like, it is a known phenomenon. Like, every filter has this like difficulty between the 0.1 and 0.3 microns. But the HEPA filter, their efficiency goes from like 99.99 down to 99.94, which like, whoa, oh no. And then from the 0.1 smaller, they're still back 99.99% effective. So your HEPA filter is this really, really effective filter, and you find those in your air purifiers, or what I call portable air cleaners, and sometimes you find them commercially in like a clean room as a filter to capture really everything. And they can be incredibly effective at cleaning. I remember if you have it in an air cleaner, you turn that sucker on, you pass the air through that filter a few times, and you have much improved air quality. There are also furnace filters that don't reach the HEPA level, but are also designed to capture those tiny particles, not as incredibly as effectively as HEPA filter, but still really well. And the furnace filters themselves are on a scale called MERV, for minimum efficiency reporting value, and it's just a scale that describes a different filter's ability to capture smaller particles. So the higher your MERV, the more effective your filter will be at capturing those really tiny particles. So for a furnace filter, we like a MERV 13, because those are the filters that are tested and designed for capturing those particles down to like 0.3 microns and smaller and stuff. You don't find many of those in the wild. Most homes have like a MERV 6 or a MERV 8, and that's going to do a great job capturing some dander and some larger particles in the pet hair. And then commercially, you really only ever find a MERV 8. You might get lucky and find a building with a MERV 13. The new library has MERV 13 filters, but the only thing that's required in the state is a MERV 8, so that's what you find. And those are filters that are not designed to capture those tiny particles.
So here's a question. So as far as the furnaces go, is there any efficacy, though, to... And maybe it's not even possible if I can't get a MERV 13 filter for my furnace. I was just thinking, is there any value in just running the fan and circulating air through the furnace filter? But if filters that are available are not going to do anything for wildfire smoke.
Oh, well, they are available. People just don't tend to have them as their default. So you have to actually go and make that purchase and get yourself a better furnace filter. If you can get them much cheaper online in bulk than on a single year basis in the store. And so you can put in a better furnace filter and run your furnace fan and clean your whole home, which is an awesome option. If you want to use your air conditioning, though, before you increase that filter's efficiency, you need to make sure it won't cause the coils of your air conditioner to ice up. And if there is an issue with airflow restriction from a better filter, then you want to use the portable air cleaner with HEPA filters, and just use your regular filter in your air conditioning unit.
And all of this information is on montanawildfiresmoke.org. Tons of handouts, specifics on MERV and HEPA filters and product recommendations, so you can find all of that online too.
And I also want to throw out a plug for people who maybe don't want to spend a couple $100s on a portable air cleaner, and maybe they don't have a central air handler. You can make your own air cleaner.
Oh,
because
nice.
I was going to toss you this one.
Yeah, an air cleaner, it's a fan and a filter. So you get yourself a fan and a filter, and you can have yourself an air cleaner. So get a newer box fan built after 2011, because up until 2011, they sometimes got on fire, and they were recalled.
Fires
So-
which create smoke in your home. We don't want that.
It really, really undercuts their effectiveness as an air cleaner. So get a newer box fan, and then a MERV 13 furnace filter. And like I said, if you get those online in bulk, you can get them much cheaper. I bought a set of 12 for $8.50 each, and they sell like individually for like $20, $30 in a store. So definitely, if you can go with friends and family to get a bulk order of those furnace filters to stick on your box fan, save a lot of money.
Great, thanks. Okay, so before we go, I'm going to ask you this standard question. We'll start with you, Caroline.
Sure.
So look into your recent past. Is there some nugget of wisdom or book or podcast or something from the world of culture that you've stumbled across in the recent past that you'd like to relay? It can be anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about the future a lot in this job and thinking about what the future holds. And so I turn to people who have been in this work a lot longer than me for inspiration. And two that have really been rising to the top are Colette Pinchon-Battle, who's a lawyer and activist in the Gulf Coast, and then Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who's a marine biologist and policy expert, and she co-authored the book All We Can Save, which is a collection of essays. And both of them talk about the love for the future that we all need to hold, and the love that we have for each other and future generations and all of the living beings inhabiting this planet, because it's so easy to want to sit on your couch and just kind of mope while things seem to literally burn around you. But love can keep us going and keep us fighting for that future. And it keeps us there. It keeps us creative and nimble and open to all the possibilities that are still there, because we actually do have a whole spectrum of possibilities when it comes to climate change. And it's just up to us to think, what if we get this right? What does that future look like?
Whoa.
Sounds like a great read.
Well done, Caroline.
Thanks.
You got to follow that.
Yeah, always wear sunscreen.
Okay.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. If you're listening to this, it means you're listening to a podcast. Get yourself to the Land Grab podcast that our very own former Deputy County Attorney Anna Conley turned us on to, who's now a professor at the law school. Well, this Land Grab podcast is a fantastic history of how Western Montana happened in the form it is right now. I just could not get enough of it. And it's a not-for-profit thing. We're not sending anybody any money by giving this recommendation. Go get it.
Yeah, check it out.
Check it out.
Thanks, Caroline and Sarah.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
It's great to talk with you all.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming over.
Yeah, thank you, and good job with Wildfire Smoke Preparedness Week in Missoula County.
Thanks for listening to the Tip of the Spear podcast. If you enjoy these conversations, it would mean a lot if you would rate and review the show on whichever podcast app you like. And if you know a friend who would like to keep up with what's happening in local government, be sure to recommend this podcast to them. The Tip of the Spear podcast is made possible with support from MCAT, better known as Missoula Community Access Television, and our staff in the Missoula County Communications Division. If you have a question or topic you'd like us to address on a future episode, email it to communications@missoulacounty.us. And to find other ways to stay up to date with what's happening at Missoula County, go to missoula.co/county updates. And thanks for listening.
Nice.
Even got